We just finished the opening weekend for the latest video game adaptation, Borderlands, and things are not looking too good for it. As the movie opened up, it actually initially had a 0% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes. That score has fluctuated a little bit. I think it got as high as 10%, but now it's sitting at around a 9%. And that isn't just critics either, because audience score is around 50%. So it seems like people who are watching this just aren't liking it. At best, people are saying it's just kind of serviceable, but for fans of the Borderlands franchise, they're really not happy with it, which probably explains why this movie was only able to bring in less than $9 million during its opening weekend domestically. And that's on a budget, I think it was around $100 million. So things are looking pretty abysmal for it, all things considered. The Borderlands movie is the latest video game adaptation attempting to make a mark in an era where the so-called curse of that genre has been broken by other films and shows. That did not go as planned, and now after being panned by critics and audiences, the film has arrived with the problematic 4th place debut at the US box office. Right here it has the top 4 movies at the domestic box office. Deadpool and Wolverine are maintaining their #1 spot, bringing in $54 million domestically during this last weekend, and this puts the global box office total to over $1 billion. It's likely going to lose that #1 spot next weekend when Alien Romulus opens up, but since this movie made over $1 billion globally, and it's looking like it's going to be the #1 highest grossing R-rated film of all time, I'm sure the studio's fine if they're going to be stepping out of the #1 spot following all that success. It ends with Us, brought in $50 million at the #2 spot domestically, and this is, I think, roughly a $25 million budget for that movie, so that's a success, even if it's at a smaller scale than what we saw with Deadpool and Wolverine. Twisters, man, that movie's had some legs underneath it. At 4 weeks, I believe it's been out in theaters. It took the #3 spot, which is also pretty bad for Borderlands when they couldn't even beat a movie that's been out for 4 weeks. And I think they both roughly had the same budget. Maybe Twisters, I think, had like 150, 200 million. I can't remember what their budget was exactly, but they're actually been going pretty good. And I think that has to do with the fact that they were just trying to make a fun summer popcorn flick and not trying to have like a bunch of messaging or anything like that in it. Meanwhile, Borderlands is a pretty abysmal opening that people could say like, oh, well, it opened up at 4. It's like, well, yeah, but considering how much they made or spent on making this movie, $8.8 million is not really something to brag about. The film tried a game-ditching PG-13 rating and an original story to appeal to a more general audience. And I really don't understand why you would try to change the story up from the game to appeal to general audiences, because the game was wildly popular, and if you think about the first game, it's not like audiences for that game understood any of the lore or anything like that. So I don't see why they have to change up to a story to try to appeal to general audiences, because when you're doing that, you're basically saying the story in and of itself is not very good, so we need to change it to try to appeal to audiences. But the game was popular, so obviously audiences were receptive to the story, or maybe they're saying the story itself won't appeal to movie-going audiences. And if that's the case, then why are you trying to make a movie about it? And if you are going to do that, then wouldn't you try to at least do it at such a lower budget so that you are more guaranteed to actually make your money back? But it seems like that's not what they did with this one. I think what really happened is the studio had the license to make this movie. So like, well, we have the rights to do this, so we're going to be doing it whether we actually think it'll be good or not. And this is really the result. And it also doesn't help with the fact that they hire a filmmaker who personally isn't a fan of the games and set out to actually be subversive to the games. And when you're going to kind of start from that point, well, then you're already starting off on a bad foot. But then they were not interested, and hardcore Borderlands fans did not appreciate the many significant departures from the game in terms of storyline, characterizations, and casting. The film had 2 high-profile Oscar winners, Cate Blanchett and Jamie Lee Curtis, and a huge box office draw, Kevin Hart, but did not utilize them to full effect. I would argue that Kevin Hart is not really a huge box office draw. Yes, he's been in some really popular movies, but I don't think people are going to see a lot of the movies that he's in just because he's in it. They're usually going to go see those movies because of whatever factor, whether it's built off of some other IP that they enjoyed or because some other big box office draw is in the movie, but not necessarily Kevin Hart specifically. And also the fact that they had Cate Blanchett and Jamie Lee Curtis, they're like, oh, it's 2 Oscar winners. It's like, yeah, but you got to think the audiences who would be drawn to a movie because Cate Blanchett and Jamie Lee Curtis are in it are not necessarily the audiences who would be drawn to a movie like this. And this is a problem that I've seen with a lot of things recently where they think like, okay, if you have like whatever type of representation, or if you put something in a movie that we think is trying to attract a certain demographic, well, then that demographic would be more interested in watching it. And that's not really how it works. It's kind of like, okay, they were like, well, we got this movie that will attract video game fans because it's based off a video game franchise. How do we get, I don't know, older people to watch this movie too? Well, we'll put some older actors in it that they would know, and then they'll come watch it too, right? Well, no, that's not really how it works. What you instead get is a movie that you have to be a video game fan, and you also have to be a fan of older actors. And if that's the case, well, then maybe you'll enjoy this movie. But we can see from the box office results, that's a really small segment of the audience. They think it basically just compounds and adds to their existing audience when you try to put in this type of representation. But instead, what it does is it just shrinks the scope of your potential audience down. And that's why you have these huge box office flops. And it's also why we see a lot of movies failing at the box office when they try to put in a bunch of intersectional casting and other things like that, because they're just shrinking down their potential audience whenever they do that sort of thing. So this really wasn't a smart move on their part. The good news for Borderlands is that reportedly 60% of its production costs were covered by international ticket pre-sales, says the studio. Though with a $115 million budget and $30 million in marketing and distribution, it is an enormously tall order to make that back with such a low premiere like this. So basically, they're saying they spent $145 million on this movie and they need to make that back in global box office. Usually when it comes to domestic ticket sales, the studio gets around 50% of that. When it comes to international ticket sales, which they're saying they got a huge amount of pre-sales for, they get around 40% of that. So when this is all said and done, this is a movie that probably needs to make around, I don't know, $320 million in order to just break even. Now, keep in mind, the studio isn't happy with just breaking even. They're not going to invest this much money in a movie in order to just make their money back. They want to actually make a profit on it. So it's looking like this movie is probably going to be one of the biggest box office bombs of the year, considering how little they're making and how much they spent on it. And it is kind of a shame too, because I think this is a movie that could have worked if put in the hands of a filmmaker who actually understands the source material. Because the problem with what Eli Roth was doing is he wasn't a fan of the games. He just kind of knew the basic aesthetic of it. And that's really what we get when it comes to this movie, or at least that's the impression I got from this movie. It's basically just some generic Guardians of the Galaxy ripoff with a Borderlands paint job and not even done very well. It's like the Wish.com version of Guardians of the Galaxy, or the Wish.com version of Borderlands. And that's kind of a shame too, because this is something that I think could have actually worked. Yes, it is a lot like Guardians of the Galaxy, or at least kind of the tone and vibe. It would just have to be a more edgier version of it. So if you were to put this in the hands of a competent filmmaker who was actually trying to set out and make something like that, who was a fan of the source material, then I think this could have been a decent movie that a lot of people enjoyed. But instead, this is what we get because it was put in the hands of people who don't know the source material, don't respect the source material, and really just aren't that great of filmmakers. But let me know what you think about all this in the comment section below. And if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with the latest entertainment news. And don't forget to click that like button and share the video out there, because it really helps out with the channel. Thank you.